Welcome very much everyone to our webinar this afternoon on electric cars and car charging. I always start every webinar with a quick plug for the future ones that are coming up. So we've got 2 more in January. One, the first date of 3 on the webinar on solar panels, which I'm sure will be very well attended. The third and final run of the webinar on housekeeping and quick wins for saving energy. Very practical session looking at what can you do straight away that will start reducing your energy use, your energy bills. Then another run of today's webinar. So if you finish today thinking, oh, I wish somebody else in my church or my diocese had been there, then they've got one more chance, which is to come along at 6 o'clock on Tuesday, the 2nd of February. We're trying to run each webinar once in the early evening for people that are at work all day and can't make these daytime webinars, and then a second run of the solar panel for churches webinar. All of the details of those are on the Church of England website. You search for Net Zero Webinars Church of England and they'll come up in Google, but I'm sure Joe will be, as I speak, finding the link and popping it in the chat. In terms of housekeeping, because this is now an actual Zoom webinar rather than a Zoom meeting, we're going to use the Q&A. So instead of putting your questions in the chat, as we've done in the past, if you can put them into the Q&A box, that would be great. And then that allows us to either mark that we'll answer them live at the end, or we can type the answers in as we go along. I've also had 5 questions that came in by email in advance. So if you were one of those 5 people, don't worry, I've got a note of your questions. I am recording the talk and it will be posted to our website in a few days' time, so that you'll be able to find it there. And after today, I'll send round the slides and a link through to our feedback survey to everyone who's here today. So that's all of the intros, all of the housekeeping. In terms of the intros, our speakers today are Phil Davies and Nigel Jenkins from Cumbria Action on sustainability, and Adi Powell from Charge My Street, and they will be guiding us through the world of EV cars, EV car charging, and whether or not it might be an appropriate thing to take forward in your church car park. And then from the Church of England, here on the webinar today, there's myself and Joe Chamberlain from the Church of England Environment Programme. I think at that point, if I stop sharing my screen, and Phil, we're over to you first, aren't we?
Right.
We can see that, Phil.
That's great. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you very much to the Church of England for giving us this opportunity in presenting something of incredible importance. Obviously, everyone who's listening will be dealing with COVID, but it must not make us forget the other great challenge as well, which is climate change and our environment. So what I'd like to do with my colleagues is just spend the next sort of 30 minutes running through a kaleidoscope of issues around electric vehicles that are specific to people who look after church buildings or community and Church of England premises. So we're very much tailoring this to yourselves in terms of whether it's worth considering hosting a charge point and charging electric vehicles from your premises. We'll run through 1 or 2 examples of options for you, and we're going to finish, I suppose this almost dovetails with one of your other webinars, which is about integrating electric vehicles and solar PV and battery storage. As Catherine said, please, if you're not sure about things, post the questions in your questions and answers, and we'll do our best either during or after the talk to answer those. First and foremost, don't rush out to get an electric vehicle or tell everyone to get electric vehicles. We must all remember the sustainable transport hierarchy. I'm sure you're all familiar. Walk if you can, cycle if you can, use public transport, car share, obviously that's difficult at the moment. If you have to drive an electric car. We then go into the deeper, darker recesses of petrol and diesel and air travel. But rather than to default to electric vehicles, let's try and see whether we can all make that difference in using our feet or our legs or our public transport. For the purposes of this talk, we're going to focus absolutely on 100% electric vehicles rather than hybrids or extended range electric vehicles. So you might hear today or elsewhere about a word ICE. ICE stands for internal combustion engine. None of what we're talking about today concerns internal combustion engines. These are 100% electric vehicles and charging. So why change now? Well, I mentioned the climate. You can't help on a Sunday night to watch David Attenborough and be mindful of what a special planet we have. And of course, transport is responsible for so much of those emissions. And it's just wonderful to be in a webinar with an organization like yours, where absolutely at the heart of what you've said is that commitment to safeguarding the environment, as you would put it, God's creation. And it is a social justice issue as well. If you think about where pollution happens, it's often in urban areas where there's poverty. If you look at the issues about climate change, it's often in the most marginal areas where the most economically and social marginal communities live. So it's absolutely imperative that we all make that change and that commitment. And as you've said, get your house in order. We try to do the same on a personal basis and in our organizations. There are legitimate environmental concerns with rolling out electric vehicles, and they are elaborated in many articles, but I would absolutely signpost you to an electrochemist called Dr. Ewan McTurk from the University of Dundee, who spent his forensic chemist life looking at all of the carbon emissions, the embodied energy, the production and manufacturing costs of batteries, of internal combustion engines, and so forth. He's got a whole series of YouTube videos tackling these environmental concerns. There are impacts. There are always impacts. But you'll see in front of the screen there the takeaway message. And it's really important to filter out some of the issues, not to negate them, not to do something about them, but to focus on the fact that actually, if you take your worst performing EV and you run it on fossil fuel, if you manufactured it using fossil fuels, if you charged it using a fossil fuel tariff, and you compared that against the best performing petrol engine that's doing over 70 miles to the gallon, after 25,000 miles, then the electric vehicle is, I guess you would call, carbon positive in terms of its relation to the internal combustion engine. Actually, if you take into account countries like Norway, which run 100% renewable energy for their electricity, if you think about that charging, if you think about countries where they're manufacturing batteries and cars from using renewable energy, then actually that pivot point happens at about 10,000 miles. So be in no doubt, these are overall a real benefit to the environment and to health as well. I'm not going to dwell on this. Suffice to say that if we look where my cursor is at Norway here, the manufacturing costs of all cars are relatively the same. It's the batteries in electric vehicles that make their manufacturing embodied energy perhaps even as much as 50% more than a petrol or diesel. But actually, because they don't have any exhaust emissions, that's what's making the difference. And particularly where they are run off renewable energy tariff or renewable energy sources, then it's incredibly positive. Ewan McTurk looks at all of the consideration of car batteries. There are social environmental audits now I've talked about renewable energy. It's really important that that we switch wholesale to renewable energy. And we know that these batteries are going to be not just recycled, but reused, which is much higher up in the hierarchy of recycling. So they're not there yet, but environmental improvements in the manufacturing and charging of electric vehicles and batteries is happening. Of course, the cost of running an electric vehicle is a lot cheaper than a diesel or petrol vehicle. And if you were very fortunate to get a special nighttime tariff or in the morning at 5p, you might be able to charge a full charge at as little as £2. I mean, realistically, to do 100 miles would cost about £6 as opposed to sort of 12, 13, £14 with a petrol or diesel. We know the government are favouring the change to electric vehicles. They've no new sales in 2030. There's grants. ADI will cover some of those grants. And actually, some of our cities, you won't be able to drive with diesel vehicles in the future. And finally, I'm just going to finish that irrespective of all of these things, actually, if any of you have been fortunate to sit in an electric vehicle or those that haven't, actually the whole feeling of being in an electric vehicle, not only can it fill your heart with a bit of pride that you're not causing damage to the environment, but it's also a much more sympathetic driving experience. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Nigel, who's going to talk about why actually host a charge point.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil, and good afternoon, everybody.
Looking good, Nigel.
Thank you very much. So I'd just like to start by thinking about where we can charge an electric vehicle at the moment. And essentially it falls into three main options, which is charging at home, charging on the road, and charging at the destination. And they all have typically different types of chargers that are used. Home charging very often will be a slower charge, and very often people will leave the car charging on the drive overnight. Whereas during your journey, clearly you prefer the car to charge much more quickly. When you reach the destination, then there may be a variety of charges at all sorts of locations, whether that's a workplace, a hotel, a shop, a cafe. And so the charging infrastructure is all evolving to try and meet this quite varied and complicated scenario. And if you look at a website like ZapMap, then ZapMap shows the current public charge points available across the UK, and you can already see there's a huge range of charge points even here in the north of England. And there are a variety of types of charges, types of locations, and they vary in the speed and the way the electricity is delivered. Now, a lot of electric vehicle drivers have an adage of ABC, which means always be charging. So it's rather like a mobile phone, where very often if you see a wall socket, you think, oh, I'll just plug the phone in and get a few more minutes charge on my phone if you're out and about. And the same very much applies with electric vehicles. So the ideal really is to try and build the charging of electric vehicles into people's daily routines and their lifestyle. So in that sense, charging can almost take no time at all, because it's actually part of something you're doing anyway when the car is parked. And if we think about church buildings as community hubs, then already they can serve a whole variety of purposes. So, for example, I was looking online and seeing just some of the sheer variety of the way in which church buildings are used now, whether that's the church itself, the church hall, or indeed faith schools as well. So it could be anything from shops through to play centres, food banks, and even on the bottom right there, I think there's a beer festival. So really a very broad range of different types of uses. And a couple of stories here about a vicar who took on the local post office franchise for the local area to locate that in the church rather than lose the post office service. And then also a cafe as well. So I'm sure you could cite many more examples of the way in which some of these church facilities are being used these days. Now, I think it's fair to say it's unrealistic probably for most people to think about hosting a petrol pump in somewhere like a church building or indeed at home. That's really not going to happen realistically. Whereas if we look at electric vehicles, then there is an opportunity, because this is a clean technology and something that we can readily provide at most buildings. And by adding an electric vehicle charge point, this becomes an amenity which is available to the people who use that location. So some of the main benefits of hosting an electric vehicle charge point, it offers that extra service and facility. So while people are parked for a church service or a meeting used for community activities, then the vehicle can be charging while they're using the facility. And it makes best use of what electric vehicle drivers tend to call dwell time, which is the idle time when the car is parked and charging. Then ideally you want something to do at that time, rather than just sitting in an isolated car park scrolling through your emails. Ideally it would be combined with some other activity. It's also an excellent complement with other environmental responses. So where the Church of England has a climate agenda and a response, quite rightly, to the challenges we face, then this fits very neatly into that overall agenda. And it's also a very visual way of contributing to the public confidence on electric vehicles, because by seeing the charge points, it means that people think, oh yes, there is an infrastructure in place. Switching to electric vehicles is real, it's happening now, and there are places already where I can charge it. So with that, I'm going to hand on to Adi now, who's going to talk about some of the options for hosting a charge point.
Thank you, Nigel. I just share my screen. It's right there, isn't it? Marvelous. Right. So, if following Nigel's presentation just there, you feel that the building that you might be responsible for, church building, community hall, whatever, could be a potential host for a charge point. I'm going to look at the potential options for making that happen. So the most straightforward one, to a large extent, is install and manage it yourself, whether it be as a church body or a parish council, or you could go for approaching one of the large players in the market, the ones that you see about predominantly on motorways, trunk roads, and in supermarket car parks. And this is dominated by ChargeMaster, Shell, Instavolt. There are other suppliers, but those are the three that tend to come to mind. Or you could go for a community-based model, which is sort of why I'm here, because I represent part 3. But I also represent, I'm not just here as ChargeMaster, I'm here as someone who just wants the electric vehicle charging infrastructure to expand. And in many ways, I'm not really bothered which of those 3 you go for, as long as you go for one of them, ideally, because as Nigel's just said, that will boost confidence in the take up of EVs. There will be less anxiety about where you're going to charge, is the charger going to work? And as we build up to the cessation of ICE vehicles being sold, new ones being sold in 2030, we can get to that target and make it inclusive for everybody who would like to change to an EV from an ICE vehicle. Before we address, there are some certain, before you can make an informed decision, there are certain bits of technicality you have to think about. The one question I get asked the most is, how long does it take to charge an electric car, charge a car? The simple answer is that it depends. The car determines the rate of the charge in kilowatts, and the size of the car battery also is related to that. Now, there are 2 types of charging. You either have what is known between slow and fast charging, which is often AC supply, or the DC rapid charging, which are the ones that look more like petrol pumps that you'll see on the motorway. They tend to be quite near the motorway services buildings. Charge My Street, it's a lot simpler installing AC charge and lots cheaper installing charge points that run off the AC supply. DC ones require different connections and are a whole different kettle of fish. So those are the DC, the rapid chargers. So rapid really is charging at 50 kilowatts and above. The Ecotricity ones, you can see top left, those are the ones tend to be quite prevalent on the motorway network. And bottom right are the Jenny ones from Shell, which they've just done a deal with Aldi. You can see an Aldi in the background there to install at their new locations. But I say that's DC, where it still depends on the capability of the car, but the conversion from the AC network to the DC, because you need a DC current to charge the battery, that happens in the big unit rather than on the car itself. These are the ones that we as Charge My Street and other, you know, smaller networks install, and these are AC chargers. So obviously it's an AC current coming to the car, and then that is converted into DC by the converter on the car. We do get asked all those, is there a standardization of connections? On the whole, yes. Across Europe now, type 2 for AC charging, which is the image on your left, has been pretty much standardized. It's different in North America and certain other markets, but certainly across Europe, that's the case. And the people who had been working with the other standards, Nissan most notably, are abandoning their existing standards in Europe and moving to the type 2. So that's for your AC charger. And then to connect and charge from a rapid charger is the combined charger, which you can see on the right, which is essentially an AC charger with a little bit added on the bottom. So there is a standardization going on, and this is really helping bring down the costs for installing. As I said, the charge rates is determined by the car. So just very quickly, if you go to one of our chargers, which run at a maximum of 22 kilowatts, the maximum you can charge at depends on your car. And we've got the four popular cars here. Left-hand end is, I know we weren't going to talk about hybrids, but that was the most popular hybrid on sale in the UK, the Mitsubishi Outlander. That can only ever charge at 3.7 kilowatts. The other end is a Renault Zoe. That can charge at 22 kilowatts off an AC supply, and it's got about a 50 kilowatt hour battery. So it's going to take 2.5 hours to charge. The other ones are in the middle. The lower figures are the ones, if you're going to go along to one of those rapid chargers, that's the maximum rate you can take, though the majority of rapid chargers in this country at the moment charge at 50. So even if you had one of those lovely Audis that could charge at 120 kilowatts, you're only going to be able to charge at 50 unless you're in the south and you can find one of those, the super rapid chargers. And just in comparison, if you're lucky enough to have somewhere to park your car off street and that's close to your house, the wall box type chargers, you can see one there, can only charge at just over 7 kilowatts, because the UK housing is basically has a single phase supply. And so that is a Renault Zoe. And even though that could charge at 22 kilowatts of AC of this single phase supply, it can only ever charge at 7. So that suits for your if you have overnight charging. But obviously a lot of people don't. About 30% of households we find don't. And I'm not going to concentrate on this particular graphic here. As Catherine said, we're going to supply the slides afterwards. But for the dwell time Nigel was talking about before, so this middle area, I can't use my cursor on there because I'm in full screen mode, but that middle area, so you thought church services, church functions and stuff, you're thinking around a 2-hour dwell time, which is why the sweet spot there in terms of your charge rate. You don't need rapids, and they're very difficult to put in and very expensive. You don't need anything that fast. You need something that has the capability of charging somewhere between 11 and 22 kilowatts to give you the optimum dwell time versus the amount of charge you're going to get. So, you know, you can refer to that at your leisure. So there are, those are the technical issues, you know, why you would choose a certain rate of charger, and there are cost and practicality things. There are issues that we have to consider when we're looking at sites who might actually use this now or in the future. Clearly at the moment, with travel at quite a low level, we are seeing, you know, relatively little use of our public charge point network. However, electric vehicle take up is outstripping ICE by a long way, certainly in the 6 months, it's not 6 months, is it? 4-5 months from last September, and we can only see this going up. And indeed, there are projections of 1 million plus electric vehicles on our roads in the next 3 to 4 years. Other things you need to consider if you are hosting your own electric vehicle charge point. Will this be for public use, i.e. can people come onto the premises at any time of the day or night? Will it just be for your users, your members, or will there be a mix of the two? And there are various solutions, and I won't delve into them now, but they're both practical sort of hardware solutions and software solutions that you can use to tailor how it's going to be used to your particular situation. And we have found there is no one size fits all. There are always different things to every site, whether they be the power that's coming to the site, or a narrow gate, or the fact that you have school children maybe going across the site at certain times of the day. So these are things that need to be considered, as well as the very physical things of where you're actually going to put the parking, where you're going to put the chargers. Are there any parking restrictions? These are all things that need to be considered. Now, whichever solution you go for, there are two basic models of operation, i.e. getting the electricity to the charge point. One is using the building supply, which is by far simpler than the other one, and cheaper, of course. And then the other one is if you don't have a suitable building supplier, you apply to your network, your distribution network operator, and you have a new electricity connection. This clearly takes time and quite a lot of money, and depending on where you are, quite a variable amount of money. Here in the north, we seem to find our new electricity connections are very expensive compared with, we have just put in a charge point for a community car club in Wiltshire, and the new connection was about a quarter to a third of the cost as it would have been up here. So it's something to also bear in mind. So option one was use the building supply. Ideally, if whether it be us or any operator coming in, if they wanted to connect to the building, you'd like to see something on the left, which is a lovely modern 3-phase supply to the building with available capacity, you'd hope. And on the right is a rather antiquated single-phase supply that really wouldn't take plugging any kind of electric vehicle in without causing a lot of trouble. If you were to have the available building supply like the one on the left, you would then end up with units like this inside. The one on the left-hand side there is a local boys and girls club close to where I live. As you can see, it's relatively small and neat. You can be tucked out the way, so the impact on the building is quite small. Where you use the building supply, the network operator, be it Charge My Street or anyone else, then reimburses the church building, the village hall, for the electricity used at an agreed rate. And so the host at no point is left out of pocket. And the left-hand side there, on the other side of the wall you're looking at, is what we can see here, where we've got wall-mounted sockets, and one of our directors, this Anne Leafs, plugs in, happily charging away there. If you don't have that, then we have to, as I said, approach the distribution network operator. In our case, up here where I'm based in Lancaster, it's Electricity Northwest, and they will guide us to the most appropriate place to connect to the existing network, to put our feeder pillar, which is the box marked A on the diagram, and will give us a cost of some thousands of pounds of how much that's going to cost to connect, dig up and reinstate. That's your feeder pillar. This is one where it's had a new connection. This is also not far from where I am at the moment. Feeder pillar has all that switching gear that we looked at that was inside, and those are the sockets themselves. So that's a single post with 2 sockets connected to it, so you can charge 2 vehicles at the same time. Another example here, this is in Cumbria. This is the Victory Hall in Broughton-in-Furness, which has a similar setup where you connect it to the building. The elephant in the room is, can we make money from hosting an electric vehicle charge points? I've got to say the bottom line at the moment is not really. As part of the project that we are now in our second phase with Innovate UK, the first phase did some projections of where the break-even point. Now this obviously would depend on usage, depending on rural versus urban environments, but you're looking at between 40 to 60 months to pay back if you were paying for the whole installation yourself. And unfortunately, that's around the time that the hardware would need renewing. So in terms of, can you make big money? You might be able to make a little bit of money if you agreed, if you're using your building supply and you agreed a favorable tariff to the building. If you had renewable capability, whether it be hydro or solar, there are a little bit made, but not really. So how much will it cost to install? You can install and manage yourself. OLEV grants are available. They are £350 per socket. So with the total cost, you're looking at about £800 for a commercial. I say dumb socket. That is just one where you plug in, it starts. You unplug, it stops. But the problem with that is then you, as the host, have to provide free electricity, and you've got to manage and maintain it. As we've said before, you've got to approach a large player. These are dominated by the fossil fuel companies, though by no means all fossil fuel companies, and there are some venture-backed ones. Most notably, I must put in the venture-backed one, Electric Blue, who at the bottom, I've said closed networks. On the whole, the fossil fuel companies have closed their networks. They don't allow interoperability. I hate that word. But Electric Blue do, so I must just give them a shout out. The advantage of this is all installation ongoing costs are covered by the installer. So, there's no cost impact on the church or the church hall, but they will be looking at the commercial model of where you are, be it rural, urban, how much take up, is there limitation on when it can be used, and it's difficult sometimes to make the commercial case. The third one is a community-based model like Charge My Street. We're a community benefit society, so member-owned, not-for-profit. We also, thanks to Innovate, there is no cost impact on the host. And we like to think that we're not just all about the commercial side of things. We're all about the social inclusion. So, we have the opportunity to go into places that the commercial guys wouldn't. And we're all about being open to interact with the other roaming networks. And so on that point, it might have made sense for me to then go on about how Charge My Street would do it. But we thought it would be better if Nigel from CAFS gave us sort of a separate view of how CAFS think a community-based option is the best one. And I will hand over to you, Nigel.
Okay, thank you very much, Adi. I'll just share my presentation again. So I will do my best without any bias. We're completely impartial. We will give you a quick introduction to Charge My Street as one of the options for hosting an electric vehicle charge point. And essentially, it's about getting your premises ready for the EV revolution, which Phil has already introduced at the start. We are going to be switching. It's a case of how we do that and how we support the transition. So we are part of a program called SOSCI, which is about scaling on-street charging infrastructure. And this is a multi-partner program supported by Innovate UK, and it's through something called the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles. And essentially, we're working with Charge My Street as a community benefit society. So what we're doing is installing public charge points to try and add to the infrastructure available and try and help some of the more challenging areas to have confidence to switch to electric vehicles. And we've got an aspiration of trying to install charge points within 5 minutes walk of people's homes. That's the long-term ambition. So there's a particular focus on these kind of scenarios where you may have homes without private off-street parking, so terraces and flats, and also rural areas that may not be readily served by some of the bigger networks that Adi was talking about. And there's an extreme example here of Alston Moor in Cumbria, which is quite remote, and realistically the BP and so on are unlikely to be setting up there in the immediate future. But it is all about growing that public confidence in having the charging network. So just 3 quick examples of installations that Charge My Street have completed so far. One is in a community hall in West Cumbria, in Broughton-in-Furness, and then also in Southwest Cumbria, a hospitality venue. This is a residential hotel accommodation, and also in the education sector, Kendall College. And as I've said before, the church estate also offers an excellent opportunity for hosting a charge point in our view, given these are already community hubs and very often with their own private parking. For the program we're involved with at the moment with Charge My Street, there are some core criteria where we're looking for sites, particularly with 2 or more off-street parking spaces that could be allocated to EV charging, a good mobile data signal, because the EV driver will need to be able to access mobile data or broadband in order to be able to charge. The charging bays need to be available ideally all the time, but certainly at peak periods and overnight. And they need to be near those residential areas with the limited off-street parking. And one key criteria is that it does need to have the involvement and agreement of site owners. So when a site is nominated by somebody, we just want to make sure the people who operate the site are aware of that before the nomination is made. As Adi alluded to, the charge point installation typically in this program is cost neutral. So while the program may well be able to help install a charge point often at no cost to the host site, equally it isn't a case of making profits, because Charge My Street is a community benefit society, not making profits. And equally, the host wouldn't be making profits out of this service either. The real added value is the support that Charge My Street could give you with the initial installation of the charge point and then operating it. So the charge point's operated by Charge My Street, and it would use the existing electricity supply for the building, and then Charge My Street would reimburse the building owner or operator on a quarterly basis so that it would be cost neutral. So for those interested in possibly finding out more and seeing what the next steps might be in potentially hosting a charge point, then our first port of call really is the Charge My Street website, which has a lot of information available around the hosting opportunity. And there's various resources, including a video on the website, which introduces the chance to host a charge point based on the criteria that I've just mentioned. And then there are also some case studies on the website as well of existing installations. And this is one of those case studies in Southwest Cumbria at West Point House, where we had a successful installation in the second half of last year, and that was working with a very enthusiastic owner of the site. So we were able to make decisions quickly and move forward with that one, which was fantastic. And the local mayor came to open the charge point when it was unveiled. And if you go onto the Charge My Street website, then you're able to nominate a possible charge point location for consideration. And by doing that, you enter a postcode or address, you can put a pin on a map, and then you can enter some basic details about the location in order to allow us to assess the site as a possible site against the criteria that we have. There are existing sites nominated on there, so it is worth checking that the site that you have in mind hasn't already been nominated. Possibly it might have been, depending on where you are. And just a final reminder of the criteria that I mentioned. These are explained fully on the Charge My Street website, but the key point really is to make sure that you have the involvement and the agreement of whoever is operating and owning the site. And if you're able to check the criteria first before making a suggestion, then that really does help to give you the best opportunity to proceed based on a fit with the project criteria. Okay, that was a whistle-stop tour through Charge My Street. So just finally, I'm going to hand back over to Phil, who's going to very briefly talk about the possibility of integrating renewables and solar power into charging an electric vehicle based on a renewable scheme that you may already have fitted at the church location. So I'll hand over to Phil.
That's good.
Thank you. One of the questions that I can see that the sort of repetitive questions that are coming through is about, the carbon emissions of using electric vehicles. Ideally, if you have a church or any premises and you can swap to a renewable energy tariff, then there is at least a connection there between the renewable energy supply and emissions. So that's one way easily of decarbonising the electricity that you use. This is a huge site. It's not the future. It just happened in December. It's down in Braintree in Essex, and there's a huge solar park with massive battery storage, which can charge 24 vehicles in 20 to 30 minutes. This is a multi-million pound project, but it shows the scale of renewable energy and charging that is possible. But on a much more realistic scale and pertinent to yours, I've left, this is the final slide, and it's heavy on figures. But one of the questions we get asked quite often is, well, would it make sense to put solar panels and battery storage if we're going to do electric vehicle charge points as well? I think it dovetails with the Church of England's "Shall I Put Solar Panels on My Roof" webinar, which is coming up soon. It's a hugely contestable area for discussion, simply because of the variable costs of installing solar PVs, of their output, of the tariffs that you might be buying your electricity from, how you're using the electricity that you produce. And so if someone was to give you a definitive answer, what's the payback, and they would say 8.5 or 12.2 years, I'd question their analysis. So what I've done is very briefly cover that a smallish solar array of 4 kilowatts would probably cost between 4,000 and 6,000. You must remember that on the sunniest day, if say 10 hours of really good sunshine on that 4 kilowatts, you might produce 30 kilowatt hours of 30 kilowatts, sorry, of electricity, which is the equivalent of £4.50 worth of electricity at 15 pence a kilowatt. So your payback, in those scenarios would be about 10 years. I mean, it's not just, please remember, it's not just about financial payback. I know resources are always tight, but it is about decarbonisation, and it's about the value and the worth of actually making a contribution to our world and our planet. A battery storage, a small battery storage, again, might be £7,500 installed, and will help you in balancing the generation that and storing that generation from your PV, and then releasing it, say, later on in the evening when it's dark and a car might come and use that charge point. But you just remember that for £7,500, you can only release 13.5 kilowatts. So it's a sort of a small element of the battery charge. But the takeaway messages are that solar PV is still a really good idea if you're using the building for lots of other things, not just for electric vehicle charge points. So if you've got fridges going, computers going, and so forth, it's a good thing to do, I would suggest anyway. You're unlikely, even if you had a roof like the one in the photo, to be able to charge lots of cars or even a single car all year round. So don't think of it in that concept. It's a contribution to that charging, and it is decarbonising. Now, we do know, and I know there's experts on this webinar who will be doing special tariffs at 3 o'clock in the morning, taking that tariff, putting it into your battery storage and releasing it into your electric vehicle, and using that solar PV in the summer to back that up, and your payback will be much better. It's a very active way of management, and perhaps it's not for every church warden or community centre host who's trying to work all of these things out. but it's absolutely all worth considering. And don't just value it in terms of financial payback, but also in the contributions to the planet. And I'm just going to finish. These will be circulated by Catherine, and it's just some additional resources to help you through some of the issues that we've raised. And just thank you very much. And we look forward to answering some of the many questions we've seen that you put on. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much. We do have a lot of questions, so I think I'm going to try and focus them on the kind of quite practical questions about EV car charging and see if we can get through some of those. And it's also obvious in the questions we've got some really expert people who've joined in to ask their specific question, and then some very general questions, and I think I want to focus on those ones as well where I can. Just starting from the bottom, can you talk about planning? If you're in a conservation area, if you're a listed building, is planning required for EV charge points?
Yes. If it's a listed building, then yes. I mean, depending on the degree of listing, I live in a listed building, so yes. However, there seems to be just a very quick answer. There seems to be a degree of flexibility given to local planners at the moment, as regards certainly low impact sockets just going, in a nice sort of out of the way area. So yes, you do. There seems to be some flexibility built, coming from on high, saying, make it happen.
And that's for a conservation area as well as a.
Yes, because yeah.
There are the practical question about how far away from the host building can the charge points be?
Up to 35 meters. I'm just trying to think. There's a church actually in South Cumbria, and I think I think 35, maybe even 40 meters. I think was the run we could get out without running into difficulties.
Okay. Then there's a few questions about sort of charging. So, for example, how do you manage having the charge point for your staff when they need it, but then chargeable for the public when your staff aren't using it? Those kind of questions. Is there a way of sort of locking it or booking it? Yeah.
Yes, that's an easy one. So as the SOSCI project that Innovate are funding us all through, have also but they're one of the partners are software developers, software and logistic developers, and so we're having our own app and backends. It is designed, it is just about to be tested. There's an email just here coming and going, it's about to go live, and so it's through software. I mean, you have signage and stuff, and if you're having a big do and you don't want loads of people charging, you just put a sack over the thing. It's a very practical one, but on a more sort of elegant solution, it's a software solution. So you as the host, through our system and through other people's systems, you can set certain times of the day for your staff, and then say overnight, local residents can use. So software is the answer here.
And is that software clever enough that you can say if it's a member of staff or a guest that it's free?
Yep.
And then there's a way that other people can pay?
Yeah, it's unfeasibly clever, to be fair. I'm not going to use half the features they built into it, but I'm just learning it now. So yeah.
There was a question: if uptake is high, does a quarterly payment leave the host building out of pocket with them paying monthly bills? I'm not quite sure I've understood that question. Does that make sense?
So if there's a sudden surge in EV adoption, and therefore sudden surge in loads of your members, your staff, your local residents all using it, then if you reconcile quarterly, then the host building is going to be out of pocket. So then you would just reconcile monthly. I mean, it doesn't happen at the moment, but I'm sure that will. It'd be lovely. I'd love to reconcile monthly.
And a question from Peter, a very practical question from Peter: how do people pay for the charging?
Simple question for our charging is through an app, because part of our agreement with Innovate is that we have to supply data back to them. data of, as much data as people will allow us. It's anonymized, but it's as much data as possible. So, things like through the app, you can also put in what your car is, and there can be other information about how full it was when you started, and just that kind of behavioral data. Innovate are really wanting to, in terms of modeling, to inform on future strategy. And at the moment, we're not going to be doing, tap and go stuff like you can, but that capability will be there. So it's something we'll look into once we get to the end of the project.
So, but talking more generally, rather than just charge my street, you said there's the 3 different models. So if the church installs a charging point themselves and they pay for it, then how does somebody pay the church if they come and use it?
Well, that, unfortunately, because for that 800 ballpark figure I gave you, that's a dumb charger, then you have no way of monitoring that unless you do it very practically by just reading a meter. You'd need some kind of smart integration, and then you could do it yourself, but that's going to cost a bit more. You could still have a software solution where your church, you would then be able to charge people. So you could run it as the church would, or not the church, but I mean the particular church would be the network operator for that location. So it is doable, and it certainly, the software will be there, but then it's a case of having someone to operate it, though it can be automated to a large extent.
I got lost in that, which I'm thinking other people might have got lost too.
Okay,
so I'm a church.
Yeah.
I spend my 800 quid and I put the charging post in the car park.
Yeah.
Then it would be free for my staff.
Yeah.
Because they can just come and plug in. But if a member of the public comes up, we'd have to either install software somehow, or we'd have to manually take 2 quid off them.
Yeah, exactly. You do that, or honesty box. I mean, it sounds very, but you say, and then you look, we're asking you for 20-25p a kilowatt hour. You get a readout. What your EV tells you how much you've had, so you say, okay, well, there's a £5.
If you were a rural church, you could put an honesty box up next to it and say, we suggest £1 for an hour if you park here.
That would be, I mean, I, as an EV driver, I'd be very happy with that. Go and park in the church, go for a walk, leave 5-10 quid. Yeah.
So you said there were 3 models. So one is I've paid my 800 quid and put the post up myself. The second was I've done a deal with a commercial operator where they've put it in my car park.
Yeah.
So is that a model where the commercial operator is actually now paying me basically to rent a bit of my car park, and then they're dealing with any income? How does that one work?
I mean, there are various ways. I'm obviously in supermarket car park, high usage car parks, InstaVolt and BP ChargeMaster are paying for rent. They would look at what they believe the usage was going to get, might pay a nominal rent, and would deal with everything. But then they would deal with all pricing and cost.
So in that model, the church isn't handling any of that payment transaction. They're just being paid a rent for having given over one of their car parking spaces. Yeah,
actually, I would say they probably would be asked to hand over to make it cost effective, and then that would be depending on the modeling. So just for example, one of the network operators, the big guys we talk to, if they don't foresee at least 2 charge sessions in any 24-hour period, 2 paid charge sessions, then they don't consider it worth installing it. I'd love to have 2 paid charge sessions in 24 hours at some of our locations, but that's by the by.
Well, we'll have a whole mixture join the webinar today from, urban churches where maybe there's a real shortage of parking in the area. I'm thinking of my local church, it's always really busy, or you've got your rural churches where it's going to be much less usage. And then your third model was the community model, like the Charge My Street. So in that model, how do people pay for the charging? That's through your app. Yeah,
that's through our app. We deal with that. So, and there was a question just on here. How do the costs of charging compare between home, overnight charging, and public charge points? So our one. So home charging, depending, and somebody else has asked about connecting to Economy 7. I don't know about Economy 7 specifically, but I know that Octopus, who we use for our charging network, have an agile one directly that gives you very cheap electricity for 4 hours between midnight and 4 a.m. So that was the Economy 7 sort of answer. There are suppliers who will give you that sort of flexibility. We're very much at Charge My Street focused on giving it the availability of home charging for local residents who can't do home charging. So with the 15, I reckon you'd pay on average about 15 pence a kilowatt hour at home. On our medium user rate, you pay 22. So there's a slight markup, but then that covers the operation and, you know, the fact you're not plugging into your house. That's our bottom line, with 22, 23 pence a kilowatt hour if you're a local resident.
Then the technology, there's a question from Alison about, is there expected to be a rapid evolution of the technology? Will rapid charging become standard?
It's me again, isn't it?
do we back a horse now, or do we wait and see what happens with the technology? That's a really common question with all of our webinars, no matter the technology, is when do you commit? Okay,
so the word rapid is twice in the question there. Will there be a rapid evolution of the technology? Yes, definitely, and that's why I think our hardware has a 4 to 5 year lifespan, because there will be contactless charging. The technology is moving so quickly as we speak. So yes, there will be rapid evolution of the technology. Will rapid charging become standard? Absolutely not, because that is thinking about it in terms of how you would think about filling up a petrol car, and that's not how EV drivers think. They think they want their car to be charging when it's not doing anything. So it's going to be on-street charging coming out of the curbs and coming out of not lampposts. I got asked that question earlier, but yeah, things like that. Phil, sorry, go in.
I think it's worth mentioning that it's quite likely in the future that energy tariffs will be very much time of use tariff. And that might mean that, depending on whether the wind is blowing, the sun is shining, perhaps the tidal marine energy is producing, or nuclear, or whatever the energy mix is, that if you can download or basically charge your battery storage in your car or in your house at a certain time, that you might get a preferential tariff. And that will probably also go to how quickly you pull on that demand. So actually, if you're happy to have it trickling in overnight, and actually some of that through the night, it might decide to stop charging for 2 hours because the wind drops down, but you will get a preferential tariff. So I think that given that scenario, there will be a whole range of different charging infrastructure.
I'm very conscious we're nearly at 5 o'clock and there are so many questions left. Let me just look at my panelists. Can you give me an extra 10 minutes, or do you need to be away at 5?
No. As I said, the ballet lesson begins at 5:45, so as long as I'm done by then.
So if I say to the audience, if you've written a question in and we haven't got to it, if you can give us another 10 minutes, we'll hang on here. Otherwise, please, no worries at all if you want to dial off at 5 and get back to dealing with all the other things you need to do today. I'm conscious we haven't done any of the questions that came in by email, and that I had said I would pick those up. So let me find those questions as well. I think one of them was about, I think we've covered, of how much it costs for charge points and cost and income. There was a question from Alan in advance about subsidies, and whether the panel's view was that electric car uptake should be subsidised in order to encourage more people to move faster. That's a policy question, really, rather than a practical question.
Yes, I'll try and answer that, but I have to say it's an individual answer as opposed to representing any political party or anything at all. Having been in renewable energy for a long time and been both a participant and, I dare say, a beneficiary of subsidies for solar PV, I have to commend the government. I do have to commend them, because they wanted to roll out renewable energy, particularly solar PV, as quickly as possible in order to generate sufficient market presence that it brought down the price of solar PV. And that's what we're likely to see in the uptake of electric vehicles. So if the question was, do you think there will be, do you think the uptake of electric vehicles will be fairly distributed across every socioeconomic group? To begin with, I would say no. Are subsidies well spent if they help to accelerate the accessibility to electric vehicle driving by everyone? I would have a slightly different answer. And finally, I would say that we need to look at different models rather than just personally owned electric vehicles, because I think we need to look at car share, car clubs, electric car clubs, and particularly some forms of social intervention.
Absolutely, with Phil on that. I mean, the social inclusion aspect here is crucial. So now, in terms of supplying the infrastructure to areas that wouldn't attract the commercial operators, that's where the Innovate funding backing is coming in. They're allowing us to make that leap. But as I've already said when I was answering the earlier question, the person without the driveway is still going to be paying more than they would if they're paying at home, and that's not inclusive. So they're already being penalised there. And then, as we in the really deprived areas that I've looked at, people are looking at me going, I can never afford an EV. So absolutely, the car club thing, we're very keen. We've just installed one for a car club down in Wiltshire. We've got two or three more ones where an electric vehicle car clubs. That's the sort of integrated answer we want. How you would, Alan's sliding scale related to how you'd actually manage that, I don't know. But I mean, I'd love that to happen.
There were two questions that came in advance, which are really more for me and Joe, because they're about Church of England policy. So one was from Jenny about whether there's a supported Church of England scheme for charge points. And the answer to that is currently no, there isn't. The central procurement parish buying are looking at the moment at a whole load of new products and services that they could offer, and electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging are on that list. So it's work in progress, but there isn't anything at the moment. And then Joe, there was a question in advance from Arthur about has the church been fast enough really to adopt to promote battery cars? And what about bishops all having electric cars?
I think possibly more could have been done if it had been pushed from the centre, but I think the bishops themselves have had quite a lot of say about what kind of car they want to have, and so that's probably, as each individual bishop has not necessarily grasped the urgency, but I think that's changing, and we've certainly had conversations here with the team at Church House about the potential for all new bishops' cars to be electric. I think the question came in about hybrid, and I definitely don't think hybrid is the way forward at the moment, but we have been talking about changing the bishop's fleet to electric. Some bishops do have electric cars. The Bishop of Reading and the Bishop of Oxford have electric cars.
Then a more practical question in advance about the space. So the space and the infrastructure. And I think you did cover this, didn't you, Eddie, in your slides? So if a church is thinking about this, they need basically 2 car parking spaces that they can give
ideally
over?
Yeah, I mean, possibly if you were doing a self-install, just the one. And this is just a sort of personal thing, I'm very keen, certainly if you haven't driven an electric vehicle, it is very much suited to somebody with physical disabilities, and so bearing that in mind with how you site, if you've just got one socket, it could be between, you put it in between 2 bays, then that thing. So space is an issue, but certainly as you saw with our sockets attached to the wall, they take up very little room, and certainly the switching gear that goes inside, you'd still have a bit of that even if you're doing a self-install, but it's quite low impact.
And roughly that space for the stuff that's inside, I mean, it looked visually, it's kind of a small bar fridge kind of.
Well, it's not even that. I mean, it's this deep, and it was just slightly higher than the cool box that was sitting on the shelf next to it. So, yeah.
Okay. I don't know when my mind went to bar fridge there, but there you go. That's my unit of measurement. Phil asked a question early on about the slides that you showed, Phil, with how environmentally electric cars have paid back, as it were, after 10,000 kilometres compared to a fossil fuel car. And he said, does that include scrapping the existing car?
Absolutely. Sorry for not getting back to that question. It involves the full life cycle analysis from all materials, their production, manufacture, right through to end of life, scrappage, reuse, recycling.
There's a question from Phil, but I think we've covered this. It says basically, can the church make any money out of it? And I think your answer really was, oh, with a following wind, maybe a little bit, but that's probably not your main motivation going into it. From
no, but long term, I mean, possibly, yeah, but more so. I mean, obviously, as the EV revolution, as somebody calls it, gathers pace, then yeah, I would have thought so. But oh, sorry, I had to. Shh. Go on. Yeah, possibly more so in the future.
Right. What haven't we touched yet? So there are two very specific ones about particular kinds of car. I'm hoping these questions make sense to you because I'm about to read out a lot of letters. I'm with Octopus Energy and will receive my new VW ID3 in March. Lucky you.
Yes.
I understand that they are trialing V2G.
Yeah, vehicle to grid and or vehicle to building, but yeah.
But it only works with the Nissan Leaf and the Cademo. The ID3 uses CCS. Can you recommend an energy supplier that utilizes V2G with CCS? I told you there were people asking questions that really knew their stuff.
The simple answer is I can't recommend one today. So just the reason I know about this is because another of our targets are use cases that we're exploring for Innovate is where you use in the case of around here be Nissan Leafs and Nissan vans for resilience hubs. So we have a church hall and a village hall nearby. We get a lot of flooding here in Lancaster, and so we have resilience hubs where people can go if there's flooding and power cuts. And the idea is rather than having a generator that plugs in, you can bring one of the council electric vehicles and they will plug into the building and run the building's electricity during the power cut and or the flood. And this is this vehicle to grid or vehicle to building that Steve is talking about there. But as I mentioned right early on in my in my presentation, the Type 2 standard is being adopted across Europe, and as he so rightly puts, the Cademo is the only one at the moment that works for vehicle to grid. However, I have a meeting tomorrow morning with a potential supplier who can get around that. So I've left Steve a message in the chat to contact me directly, and hopefully I'll be able to answer the question better this time tomorrow.
Okay. I didn't truly understand the question. I didn't truly understand the answer, but I'm hoping that you and Steve know what you're talking about.
We'll sort it out between ourselves.
There was a question from Charles, which is about if there's all this electricity, extra electricity needed for more electric cars, are we confident that the grid's going to support it?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I typed a brief answer to Charles in the Q&A on the webinar, but essentially, yes, the grid can cope and should be able to cope. And I referred Charles to the Plug Life TV channel, which Phil mentioned earlier on with Dr. Ewan McTurk. And there are, in fact, videos on there looking at various scenarios, including a kind of worst case scenario where you've got a cold winter day and there's no wind and the wind turbines aren't generating and so on, just looking at a worst case. But I'd also say that this is part of a much bigger revolution in the generation and the supply of electricity. So in generations gone by, it was more of a steady state system with large power stations kept within very tight limits, whereas now it's far more dynamic with a lot of smaller generators, including the kind of renewables that Phil's talking about, even home generation, and smart charging, which can be dynamic on different tariffs and different times of the day and night, and even putting electricity back into the grid from the car. So it's very complex and it is evolving very quickly in order to meet these new challenges.
So that's 10:05 now, and I feel like I've taken your time, and most people have stayed with us. They're clearly very interested. If someone's joining from a church because they're interested in this subject, I'm going to have the last question as host privilege, which is, what should their next step be, would you recommend?
Eddie?
Oh, thanks. Okay, good. Well, the next step be to talk. I think talk with your congregation. I think to just gauge that, because if there's a groundswell and there's that right sort of critical core of people wanting to make it happen, whether it be do-it-yourself solution or somebody might have a connection to an existing supplier, you know, if there is that core driver, it's much easier to do it as a group than do it on your own. So talk to the congregation first, and then, you know, see what connections you have. Come to us. We can always advise. You know, it doesn't have to be us doing it. Phil?
I would just say that if you live in a relatively either affluent area or an area where everyone has their own driveway, you're quite, and many of us in rural areas live in those scenarios where relatively everyone has access to their own charging at home. You may not be getting a lot of charging demand. However, if you have a church facility in a town or in an area where fewer people have driveways, you will be doing a great service to the community, to your congregation and wider community by putting in a charge point. And as Adi said, gauging that appetite is really useful.
That seems a very good point to end on. If I can just say thank you to my panelists. Apologies to the people whose questions we haven't answered. We've tried to gallop through as many as we can. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you at one of our future webinars on another day. Goodbye.
Thank you.